My name is Jeanne Jalandoni, and I am an artist and a curator of Cultural Cousins. With us today we have my very good friend, Genesis Valencia, who is also the exhibition manager, and she'll be co-moderating the artist panel. We also have 7 of our artists here today, so Max, Carl, Emily, Jeanette, Manuela, Donabelle, and Maria. So, yeah. I would first like to thank Lower Manhattan Cultural Council for awarding me a creative engagement grant to make this show possible. Thank you also to ChaShaMa for providing this generous space. Thank you to everyone here who can make it today. And a big thank you to the artists for agreeing to be a part of this show very early in the year, trusting my vision and their patience in seeing the show slowly materialize into what it is now. And of course, thank you to my family and my parents for being very supportive. So a little bit about the show. Cultural Cousins has been a work in progress for a little over a year now. The concept is rooted in my ongoing investigation with Philippine history and Filipino-American identity. So last year I was reading Anthony Christian Ocampo's book, The Latinos of Asia, How Filipinos Break the Rules of Race. And in it he discussed how the Filipinos he knew in LA associated more with the Latino community versus the Asian one. And I was really interested in that statement and was like, yeah, that's kind of true because a lot of my friends tend to be Latino. And so I wanted to research more about the cultural ties between Filipinos and the rest of Spain's colonial subjects as a way of figuring out what is native to the Philippines and also like what is native to all of us in our respective cultures and ethnicities. And I also wanted to acknowledge the similarities. So I would often reflect my findings to Genesis, who is of Dominican and Ecuadorian descent, and we would geek out about all these cultural intersections of our upbringing, like relating Spanish words to Tagalog words like ¿Cómo estás? And ¿Kamusta ka? And even how we never felt Filipino or Dominican Ecuadorian enough to be considered those cultures or ethnicities because we grew up in America. So this was just really exciting to explore.
Yeah, I'm in complete agreement. I've always also thought that these conversations that we've had were incredibly important. Like, I'm the daughter of immigrants that grew up in the United States, so I feel like I've had a lot of luxury and opportunity in terms of being able to learn Western arts and philosophy and languages and all sorts of things. But I feel like one of the things that has always been difficult to come to feeling like I fully understand is my own cultural heritage. And I feel like that's not very uncommon. Like, a lot of the times when you grow up in a family that doesn't introduce you to your cultural heritage, you just end up assimilating and you end up disassociating with a lot of the things that make you different because it just makes growing up feel a little bit easier. Like, it's easier to get along with a lot of people. So when I did come to the point where I felt like I wanted to learn more about my culture and just empower myself or advocate for representation for people that were like me or looked like me, I also felt like there weren't a lot of resources that I could turn to learn. So a lot of what I clung to were things like language or food, because I know that as a Latina person, there's a certain language that I have or certain foods that, you know, my people eat. For example, like during the holidays, something that was really big was eating lechon. And then also something that I thought was really unique to my culture was just the fact that we ate flan, like one of my favorite Dominican desserts. So it was incredible talking to Jeanne about these things, because when I would talk to her about things like lechon or flan, I just learned that she had the exact same foods and she called them the exact same names. And it was really broadening because I started to realize that a lot of these things that I thought were unique to just my culture weren't just specific to my culture. And it opened up these incredible conversations about the legacy of Spain and how it affects people in similar ways throughout so many different cultures. And because of that, I've been so supportive of this exhibition, and just the idea of Jeanne bringing together these artists from the Philippines, or like just like with heritage, Filipino heritage and Latino heritage, to further these conversations and hear even more perspectives about what people have been thinking.
So some of the artists here I met through previous group exhibitions. Some are friends of friends, and some I've just been stalking on Instagram and fantasized about having my work in conversation with theirs. I was also very intentional for the show to mix their work together, to show that we have a lot of things in common and to show that we are family. And I also wanted to create this warm, home-like environment, like having the sala, the kitchen, the recreational room, to provide an intimate setting where casual discussion is encouraged and comfort into accessing our own personal narratives is provided. I was also very particular in selecting artists that dealt with different mediums or pushed the limits of their traditional mediums, because to me that parallels what mixed cultural or mixed identity is. I also want to emphasize that these artists do not represent or speak for their entire culture. So don't look at like Jeanette's wall and say, this is Dominican art, because that is just one facet of what Dominican art could be. So it is my hope that this portrayal of our cultural kinship has some effect in dissolving any cultural, racial stereotypes that exist from the residue of Western history, and humanize the experiences of artists of color and people of color. So now we can begin the artist talk.
So thanks, Jeanne. So we'd like to start off by asking each of the artists to introduce themselves, point out their works in the exhibition, and then just talk a little bit about your practice as an artist.
Hello, everybody. My name is Max Sarmiento, and my work is this blue wall. These 5 works are mine. This little guy in the middle, and 2 outside. But as you can see, my work's like pretty bright, colorful, and playful. And like through my work, I'm just trying to share memories, experiences, and stories that have been told between my family and myself about what it's like being both Ecuadorian but also American here in New York City. So that's essentially what I'm doing with my work. I'm just sharing my experiences in both countries.
Hey everyone, my name is Carl Orozco. I am an artist, I am a gamer, and I'm a game maker. My work comprises the recreational room over there. So in the center of that room is a mahjong set that I created about a year and a half ago. It's a mahjong set created out of linoleum blocks that are printmaking blocks. And so after each game of mahjong that I play with that set with others or teach others how to play, we print records of their winning hands, which you can see on the wall against it. It's a tribute to my grandmother, my Lola or Abuela. She used to run a mahjong parlor in Manila as a way to keep her husband home. He went out a lot.
Hello, my name is Emily Perez, and I made the necklaces that are around throughout the gallery. I grew up in Mexico City. I'm half Mexican, half Korean, so I didn't see many people that came from my background and shared the same perspective as I did. So with these necklaces, I try to introduce people to the idea of having Mexican folk art with traditional Korean folk art as well.
Hello everyone, my name is Jeanette Rodriguez Pineda. My work is in this yellow wall, it's the photographs. I'm a photographer and book artist and archivist and museum educator, teaching artist. My work deals with memory essentially and how memory intersects with reality and what reality is or is not, and what it can be. I'm a total dreamer, and with the dreaming, sometimes I skew my own reality, and I have to rely on others to tell me whether or not I actually remembered something correctly. And that's something that growing up was very difficult to hear, but now as an adult I realize that it's not that I was wrong and they were right, but rather that they all exist as truths. And so my work combines my photographs along with my father's photographs and writing, and it's antiquarian processes, so anything that's black and white is platinum palladium process, which is all analog, and it's a printing process from the 1840s using platinum and palladium metals and the sun to print, and so my negatives are the size of the prints. The color photographs are all analog photos as well. I shoot medium and large format, and I still shoot with the same camera that my father gave me when I was 15, which was the camera that he first used when he immigrated to the United States.
Wrong, that's why.
Dominican Republic.
Hello, I'm Manuela Gonzalez, and I am from Colombia, but have lived more than half of my life now between Florida and New York. My work is the painting on a blanket that's all the way in the back corner, and this painting on a towel right here, along with two other little ones that are on a bath mat and on a little quilted piece of fabric. I can point them out to you guys later if you can't tell which ones they are. But through my work, I am really interested in exploring the medium of like textile making, whether it be like weaving or quilting or embroidery, and interested in how that overlaps and intersects with like a history of representational painting and abstraction, and also how it connects to me growing up, like as a kid in the same household as my grandma and my grandparents, and having one of the first creative practices that I was ever engaged in be making dresses and little things along with my grandma, and that sort of being what I consider my visual ancestry is this way of making that's really connected to like a more intuitive way of creating that's really connected to color and texture and things that belong in the home and typically our background or exist as background, and I think through my work I'm really interested in bringing those things to the foreground.
Hello, my name is Donabelle Cassis, and I was born in the Philippines, but came to the States when I was 2 years old, and moved to Seattle, lived there from 2 to 8, but then spent most of my life on the East Coast. My work are the big paintings behind me, 2 here. There are 3 over there and 2 over here. And what I'm interested in are markers and patterns of identity, sort of how we project ourselves out into the world, how we want to be seen versus how we are perceived. And so how we take what we see, what we know, our memories, our knowledge to create these perceptions. And I look at a lot of things. I look at trajes de luces, bullfighting costumes. I look at Kalinga tattoos, and I also look at facial recognition software. Just to give you a broad view of what I look at in terms of how we garner information about people and how we interpret those things.
Hello everybody, my name is Maria Liabana. I am a first generation Latina, I will say Latinx. My parents are from Colombia and Peru, and I grew up in New Jersey. Patterson, New Jersey was predominantly Black and Latino. And my work are the ceramic pieces you see sprinkled around the room. There are 3 figures. The 3 figures are self-portraits of me. I am attracted to the Rococo era, the aesthetics of the Rococo era, and it's interesting because of Rococo, how it actually, I see it within my culture in Colombia and the households that my family live in, like this aesthetic, and I'm really drawn to it, and I'm also drawn to the pastels and the gold from the basilicas and the religion that has influenced the culture and also my family and my household. So the three figurines are me laying down as if I was a Francois Bouchon. I slaughter names. And being also a plus-size girl and not living to the aesthetics and the expectations of, especially in Colombia, you're supposed to look a certain way. And so I do not fit into that mold. I curl my hair. I don't straighten it. And so in these poses, I'm pushing against that, but also it's current and I'm being lazy and I'm looking at my cell phone. And it's like a mirror, right? It's a mirror into everybody else, and I'm desiring what everybody else has, and so much more. And then they have cakes in the back. The cakes are typically, we have a lot of cakes in our family, especially when I'm with my parents. Every celebration there's a cake, but these are cakes celebrating my failures. So they're not happy or positive. They're very sad moments in my life that I documented through creating these cakes. And the rainbow arches around, they're part of another series that I did about In Search of Happiness, of rainbows, and will these rainbows make me happy, of like trying to live the American dream, but then am I, what's the word? It's like, oh my gosh, I'm living the American dream, but I'm also Latina, and I have to remember my culture and my American. So there's a lot of complex stuff in my work that I deal with when I'm making these things. So, yeah.
Yeah, so also based on like some of my studio visits with you guys, and a lot of you had storytelling aspects in your work, and I was interested in how is cultural identity documented and reclaimed in your work. For example, like, is there a role that process plays, or patterns, food, family?
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Well, obviously, when you make an object, an art piece, it's out in the world. I can't be there to explain. So many people will interpret it the way they are going to interpret it. So I use titles to like show that this is made by a Latina or Latinx artist. So all my majority of my work is in Spanish, and then there's a slight translation. If I want to give you a translation, or you can use your Google Translate to figure it out. So that's one way of showing, because it's also, if you look at my sculptures, they're femme, and they have frosting on it. It's like, where's the Latino connection there? So I'm using the titles to share that, like, this is part of it. This is one way that I do.
So I'm actually the opposite. I don't title any of my work because I want to leave it to the viewer to sort of go in the direction that they feel free to do, and because that's the nature of my work, sort of how we take what we see and make sense of it, make meaning out of it, and it's very different for everyone who sees it. So, but my relation to culture in my work is that I, specifically Philippine culture, which I've actually never researched until very recently because I never grew up with my ethnicity at home. Since my mom had remarried an Anglo, and there is a great pressure to assimilate that we didn't really do any of that at home. So when I started researching my Philippine heritage, or Philippine heritage in general, I had come across Kalinga tattoos, and specifically how they told a story on their bodies, and without language necessarily, that you were able to see where their status was in their community, what they did in their community, and sort of representing yourself without language is very fascinating to me.
Similarly to what Genesis and what you talked about having to assimilate to a culture, when I moved to US, I had really hard time adapting to I came here when I was 15, so I had really hard time in school, and I just wanted to like erase some of my background and just be like any like American person. So I never really thought about my background or what it means to be Korean, what it means to be Mexican, until I went to art school, and then I dropped off, but that's a different story. When I went back to Mexico after like almost 10 years of not being there, I started to see where I grew up in a totally different way, because when I was living with my family in Mexico, it was like all run by women. Like all the men were like gone in our life. Like everybody like had only their mothers, and like our grandmother raised us. So it was very different when I came back and saw that I'm sure that you guys have the same experience when you go home and you see something totally different than when you were living there. So I try to work with techniques and methods that are often associated with women, like weaving and braiding and beading, as a way to understand my culture from both sides, because I actually didn't grow up exposed to that culture at all. And by me doing so, I exposed my parents as well to their own culture that they left when they were very young.
I think for me, I use a lot of references to fabrics, and the way that I try to pick what fabrics I paint or represent or include in the work are fabrics that remind me of growing up, or choices that maybe more my grandmother would make or my mother would make, rather than choices that I would make for my own home. So in a way, it is like reflective of a culture that I grew up around and has influenced the way I just, like visually design my world. But that is also reflective of like the visual ideas of the women that I grew up around. And I think that this is a really interesting question, because I don't know necessarily if a lot of the pieces reflect everything visually that was going on around me in Medellin when I was growing up. But I feel like when you were talking about the influence of the Spanish invasion, how that also like affects sort of the aesthetic that you are supposed to emulate and like. And so I feel like I do end up choosing textile patterns that maybe are not like, the Ceú weavings that I like love, that you see if you go to El Museo del Oro in Colombia, but more, like the little like pillow that my grandma puts on the bed that is like the same pillow like when you're talking about Rococo in Colombia. So I love thinking about that because of like that contrast of what really would be like all-inclusive and really considering what all of our influences are, but that in contrast to what's like specifically chosen to represent yourself, and that exclusion, and that becomes a big part of the work.
So I actually went to high school in Queens, at Long Island City High School, in case anyone knows about that. And that's where I took my first art history class. And it was pretty good, but like the artists we would see were like Picasso, Matisse, etc., etc. White men from Europe, they're dope, but they don't represent me. And so with my work, I try to be explicitly myself. I try to bring out my cultural symbols explicitly. Like, if you have gone to the doorway, you'll see this yellow piece. It's a table, and on the table you'll see something that looks like a dead rat. It's not a dead rat. It's something called cuy, which is wild guinea pig, and it's like a. So I'm from Ecuador. I don't know if I said that. I'm sorry. And I'm literally from the mountains that the Incas lived on. And cuy, which is just wild guinea pig, is something that was passed down from that timeline through my family till where I am now. So I use that, symbols like that. For example, on this one, all the soccer jerseys are specific teams from my country of Ecuador. But what I also like to do sometimes is I like to take some of my favorite European artists, I like to take some of their images and paint them. Essentially, I steal their image and paint them as tan people. Like those guys, those people like that you see at the bottom right, that's actually the image that from Max Beckmann. I don't know if y'all know Max Beckmann. He's a German artist from a World War II area. So I like to use some of his imagery. I like Picasso. I love Matisse. So I try to take what they took from our, from our POC countries and change it back to my culture. And hopefully that can carve some representation for people that look like me somewhere.
Yeah, I can go. On the topic of storytelling and like processes, I've always been interested in games as like a way of having a non-linear story or a story with multiple paths and multiple endings. Specifically around Mahjong, it's a non-traditional set that I created that uses different symbolism from the traditional Chinese set. I've always been taken by the colloquial term for shuffling the Mahjong tiles. It varies depending on the country, but at least in my family and amongst other Filipinos that I've met, a lot of us call that going swimming. So it's like the shuffling, you're doing like a horizontal freestyle stroke. Yeah, and I've always been like taken by that little aphorism. And so with the tiles, I wanted to turn the traditional tiles and symbols and turn it into a creation myth of the Philippines and of that archipelago and of that island nation. So in that set, there are three gods from a Tagalog creation myth, Amihan, Amansinaya, and Batala, gods of land, of sea, and that space in between. And I wanted to have this set represent a coming together of a nation, but also a dissipating of a nation that happens through colonialism, that happens through outside influence. So that's one way I'm playing with storytelling, and by recording each game with that set, I also like thinking of the records, the print records, as a record of a community convening. It's of four people coming together and trying to push back that tide.
So my work, what we're seeing here is more so just like a snippet of a much larger body of work that I've actually been doing since I was 15. It's lifelong. It's not a project that I see an end to. And it's all based on storytelling, essentially moments within my family where, not just within my family, but also within my culture where I felt oppressed, but also how those moments are still make me who I am, and there's these moments where I feel incredibly proud of it. And for example, there's the two pieces of my Tia Griselda with the guandules, and that was taken this year. I split my time between the Dominican Republic and New York. I'm very lucky in the sense that I have both homes still. I was born here in Queens, but I lived in the Dominican Republic in Santo Domingo, and I always go back and forth. And my parents immigrated to Queens both in high school. My mom was a junior and my father was a senior, and my uncle Giovanni gave my father an old Minolta camera and was like, hey, shoot, like take pictures. This is how you'll get to know the space. And the funny thing is that my father, when he immigrated to the United States, he immigrated in the middle of winter, and my grandfather forgot to pick him up from the airport, so he was chilling at JFK. Yeah, like in a short sleeve shirt with nothing. He's like, how do I get to Queens? Or like, he was in Queens, but he didn't know where, he didn't geographically understand where Corona was. And he ended up walking to Brooklyn, and someone explained to him how to get in, yeah. So he ended up walking a lot. And so he started using this old Minolta to understand Queens. And so I grew up with this obsession of looking at my father's photographs, of understanding Corona, because I grew up in the house that my grandparents ended up purchasing. So in this house with all of my cousins, like super knee deep, all up in each other's mierda. And I became obsessed with memory as an object, specifically through the lens of my father. And he built a darkroom in his bathroom, and so I grew up looking at all of these beautiful images, and that definitely instilled within me this love of photography, or what it is to capture a moment or to freeze moment in time. And then this idea of moving forward, like being first-gen American, I see my primos having children, and we're losing a lot of our culture. We're losing our language. We're losing, for example, just our greeting. I'm not religious by any means, but I still, when I walk into a family's house, I say bendición. Not even because I care about the blessing, but just because I care about the ritual. And so I decided that I needed to somehow be this family archivist to record everything. So my main audience, honestly, is my family. I make work for them. And so my didactic information, which is the wall text, is written for them. It's not written in a traditional art speak. I work in museums, I do that all day, every day, but when it comes down to the people that I actually want to communicate with, they don't feel invited into those spaces and they don't speak that language. So for me, it's about how do I remedy that, that gap, but also revel in like this beauty of this undercurrent that's floating between all of us, right? Between what we are, where we've come from, where we're going, and how do we take all of that, put it on our backs and move forward and then share it. And so my work also deals with a lot of writing, incorporating a lot of my family's writing as well as my own. Also that I can eventually give this to my nieces and to my nephews and to everyone in my family so that they can actually understand where we come from, because I have this fear that we're the last generation that's going to have ties to this island. I'm one of the few cousins that actually goes often, and so why do we stop seeing value in this space, in this motherland?
Yeah, I think that it's for me, this like idea of being American in my work is a really big deal, because I also moved when I was a teenager from Colombia, and all of a sudden you're at this age where you're so vulnerable already and self-conscious, and you can't like properly speak the language and you don't really fit in. And all of a sudden things that in Colombia, you know, when you're living in Colombia, you're looking to like America as this role model. So anything that's American is like, you know, put on this pedestal. But then like when you become an immigrant, all of a sudden the things that maybe when you were like living in Colombia, you looked at, you know, you dismissed as every day, become these things that are like that empower you, become these bits of information that you have that nobody else has. And so they become sort of like your floating device. They become this thing that, okay, I might not be able to communicate or get the sense of humor or get the music, but I do have this experience that, you know, nobody here has. And so I feel like the moment that I became Colombian, right, which is the moment that, you know, I wasn't living in Colombia anymore, is this moment where I started sort of embracing my taste for things that I grew up sort of taking for granted, like listening to ambucos with my grandpa, you know, like the things that my grandma makes and puts all around her house, vallenato music, all these different things that when you're there, it's sort of like, yes, it's there, but that once you sort of like are out of place, become really like important to you and to, you know, like your survival in this new place.
I mean, we sort of have very similar stories, but my family moved around a lot. We moved about 13 times in my childhood, so I never felt sort of a sense of place for the longest time, and I never really had a connection to a place for the longest time. And I think having recently come upon researching Kalinga tattoos and other sort of cultural elements of my ethnicity is that I'm in the same place, sort of coming to a point where I am embracing versus before I was denying my heritage. My sister and I were literally the only two people of color in our school growing up, where we stayed the longest, and that was very significant to me. I tried to assimilate as much as possible, saying that I was Hawaiian, because I think people could relate to that. it's an island, and we're part of the U.S., and we're very friendly, and we're good-looking people, really. You know, Philippines was not on the radar. I think anyone who looked Asian was automatically Chinese. Like, there was no differentiation in cultures. So that's what I was growing up in. And so I had literally denied my own culture for the longest time. And so for me, living in the States and my work, it really is about how we take ownership of what we project into the world. And that's based on, you know, my experience with that sort of projection onto me, but then my projection back out.
Oh, sorry. So I didn't get to point out my pieces, but they're the felt pieces with the tiny paintings in them, and I call them illuminated manuscripts. And the paintings, they consist of snacks that I ate growing up when I was a child, and some of them are specific to the Philippines, like banana crackers or dried mangoes, and others it's just like Asian snacks like shrimp chips. And I feel like that was very part of me defining what my Asian identity is, which is like on top of my Filipino identity. And also I remember growing up not knowing if I should call myself Pacific Islander or Asian, because when you think of Asia, you think of East Asians, like Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and also tapping onto what Donnabelle said about Hawaii being as more accepted.
Palatable or something.
Yeah.
Relatable. I think.
Right. That also frustrated me a little bit too, because the Philippines was part of America for about 50 years or so, and nobody really acknowledges that history, that we have this American influence built in us, and it's still continuing in the way like we speak, and like a lot of Filipinos are speaking more English than Tagalog, and the language is slowly dying. And what are we doing to preserve that, you know? So also in my pieces, I also keep the price tags on the snacks so that you know where it comes, like where it ended up. But those snacks are also like the dried mango, you have them in China, you also have them in Malaysia, you have them all throughout the Southeast Asia, and same with like the shrimp chips, like they're Korean. So I think it's also important to acknowledge the trade between all of these cultures and what makes these cultures. Like Filipino identity is so mixed, and same with Latinidad. I'm sure there's a lot of cultural influences that you get. And I also know that in Mexico, the colorful floral patterns you see, that's all influenced from Asia. So what makes us like who we are? You know, that's the big question. It's so frustrating.
Yeah, I found this question really hard. I think I'm like still working through a lot of this. I'm the firstborn in my family to be born in the United States. I'm also the first boy in my family and the only boy in my family. So I think I always felt this like underlying pressure to be the breadwinner that like most boys I feel like have in their family. And with this piece that I was working on, with this mahjong set, I really wanted to remove money from the equation of playing. When I was growing up, that was always a very exclusionary force. Like whenever I wanted to play with my titas and titos, they wouldn't let me play because they said I would ruin the game. Like, and there's money on the line, and I'd be ruining the flow of money that's happening in these transactions. So it's, in some ways, it's like a direct defiance towards this goal of this American dream of what we come to this country for. But it also, I don't know, it confuses me. It's also, it takes a lot of privilege to say that money, I'm gonna remove money from this game and turn this into, I don't know, a social gathering or a social occasion. So yeah, it's a hard question that I'm still working through, but those are some thoughts.
So my mother she's Korean, and she really bought into the American dream, like that you will be from like rags to riches, like that. So she was determined that I would be U.S. citizen no matter what, and that cost her. Like my father, he left because I was born in U.S. He wanted me to be like his first daughter, to be born in Mexico and like live there. But thanks to her, I can be here because I think to me, to live in the United States and to like come to America means that I don't have to try to like survive for my living as much as my father and my mother had to. Like I have the privilege to have that room. I feel that they were the ones who moved from their home country to another country to survive and look for better opportunity. And then I was born, and then now I have the privilege of not having to do that, not having to scramble and like work like 3 jobs to make ends meet. Like I can have the space for me to make art, which they could have never imagined themselves doing because they didn't have time, they didn't have money or the right opportunities. And because I live here, that opened up for me. So coming to America gave me that. If I had stayed maybe in Mexico with like my cousins, like I would be still like struggling because we are still like in stuck in that cycle.
So just with all of this that you guys have been discussing in mind, when it comes to a work of art, when do you think you can say that a work of art has become Latinx? Or similarly, at what point do you think it has become Filipinx?
Yeah, that's complex. So hard.
Can I like pick at that question a little more? Yeah, I don't know.
Let's unpack the question.
Yeah, I think it's like, I think it's right to say that like a piece of art is made to speak to an audience, whether it's a Filipinx audience or a Latinx audience. But I don't know, just like hearing from all these initial discussions today about like difficulty with labels. Like, do we want to label art with these like labels that have already caused us so much trouble? So, sorry if I just like broke the question. Yeah. You want to go? Yeah.
So, I personally love to label myself as Latino. I'm very proud of that. I think if I didn't say that, or I didn't say that my art was Latinx or Latino, I think that'd just be kind of erasing everything that has happened through my entire history of my family. Like, not only like the last couple of years, but like our history, our ancestry. And like when I do my work, my titles are in Spanish. Everything that you see is something that's straight from Queens or straight from Ecuador. And I'm like, I like to pinpoint those things and make it explicitly my like Latin experience. I try to make it like that. And despite the fact that it's super Latino from my point of view and super from Queens from my point of view, I think that even though it has those labels, it still has any work has the opportunity to cross those labels and create conversations between cultures, people, and countries.
Yeah, we can. Anyone else have any thoughts? Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Would you like to go in front, please?
Hi. I just have a thought while all of you were speaking, how you feel if racism impacts or has impacted your work. I was first generation Colombian, born here, and I know that I bear the scars of, being the victim of racism, though I think it wasn't until much later in my life that I even realized this. And I was wondering if any of that kind of informed your process or your work.
I'd really like to speak to that.
Yeah.
While you were saying that, it really, like, especially you talking about how you didn't realize it until later in your life, I feel like, you know, this work that I'm making now is not like the same kind of work that I was making, you know, like 12, 15 years ago. And I think part of what led me there is, in a way, realizing what I've suppressed, and what I've suppressed because of all these, you know, like subtle microaggressions that have like shaped what parts of myself I'm like allowed to express, and what parts of myself I'm supposed to bury in order to kind of like fit in and participate in like in the art making conversation, contemporary art making conversation. And I feel like the work that I started making again was like, okay, what are those parts, and how can I like express that visually, and how can I start reconciling again with these like, you know, like aspects of my identity that subconsciously, you know, like have stopped becoming a part of this conversation that I have with myself. So I really like that really resonated with me, because it's like, that's like, I think the most difficult part of it is that you're not always aware that that's happening, and that there's something really empowering about realizing that, and sort of putting this puzzle back together that, you know, like at some point fell apart.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's where my work came from. I didn't, again, realize till later that that's where it was coming from, trying to make sense of why I felt very different and why I seemed very different from everyone else. And I was, you know, literally marked as different. So it's my work is about that.
I will say I am privileged because I'm light-skinned compared to my Afro-Latinas who have experienced more racism than I have. Mine are very subtle. The act for me of using the titles for Spanish is my way of saying I am Latina, and that's exposing myself, right? I am privileged in a way that I work in a place that they want my Spanish, and I can speak my Spanish and teach students to speak that language while teaching art. So I am privileged in that way. Yeah. But I do want to acknowledge that I am, like, in some ways white passing, in some ways I'm not, and so the color of my skin has let me in places where a person of dark skin color in my Latina community may have not. So there also plays a role.
I come from a culture this is a very difficult conversation, no, because of the island and how we share it with Haiti, you know. And so I grew up always incredibly aware of skin color, not just as it exists within like racism, but also colorism. And my family, as a joke, I would say that we were the grayscale because my mother was a white woman, my father's a black man, and I'm in between, and my brother is actually light-skinned. We would go out and people would assume that we weren't related. And what that does and how that scars your family. Right, and especially the women in my family. My grandmother is also a black woman, but she wasn't raised by her parents. She was given up. And the denial. There's so much denial of who we are, that we are black, but that we are indeed this product of colonialism. And what does that mean for the way that we treat each other within our family? There's this real deep denial for us, just even in the way that we look, in the way that we carry our hair. You know, for example, I was just back home 2 months ago. I'm letting my hair grow out, but it was shaved, and I have very, very curly hair, and so do all of the women in my family, but the difference is that they relax their hair. I was forced to relax my hair as a child, and finally when I was 17, I was like, no more. And my aunt looks at me and she's like, I don't know where you got that hair from, And I'm looking at her and I'm like, wow, you are so in denial of yourself that you have relaxed your hair so much that you literally believe that it comes out straight. I was like, what is it that you do on Saturdays at the salon for like 3 hours, you know, like underneath that dryer? Like, I'm very confused by this, but it's, at the same time, it's learning compassion. Because I would get very angry by the way that my family would treat me, and I'm not even the darkest person in my family. I'm very aware of my own privilege within the context of my family. And I just think about this, this era of Trujillo. I don't know how many of you actually know the history of La Española or Quisqueya or anything along those lines, and the dictatorship, how we had to create an entire race instead of saying that we were black because you wanted to survive. And my family, and it's part of my project, none of those images are up here, but my family's documentation, instead of saying negro, it says indio. And so erasure, like absolute erasure. And how does that come into the way that you then think about yourself and love yourself? And can you love yourself when all you've been taught is to hate yourself? And furthermore, for survival.
Similarly to what you mentioned about the hair, I was also forced, since I was like 8 years old. My mom was like, why you have this hair? Like, her hair is like straight, like beautiful black and sleek Asian hair, and she's like perming, like straight perm my hair since I was like 9. And like it's, my hair is like really curly, and like I combed it today. Like, I'm still trying to deal with that issue to this day. But similarly to answer your question about racism, I was very aware of that since I was little, because in Mexico it's like, oh, la chinita, you like that. And so like I was like, no, I'm Korean, there's a difference. And they're like, yeah, you're right. So I never fit in, even in Mexico. And when I came to U.S., it's like, oh, you're like Asian, but like you have like a Mexican last name. Like, what are you? It's like, so like always like not like treated well. And I went to school in Texas, and it was a very conservative, very like privileged. Like, these people were like very wealthy, so nobody talked to me. And like I briefly went to a elementary school in San Antonio, and my only friend was a black girl because she was also excluded from the entire school. So racism is always an issue for me. And similarly to what you guys have said about your family, like even within my own family, they try to, my grandmother especially, because she comes from an indigenous group, Nahual, and she is like very, very, very Christian, religious, and for her that's like a Satanist, and like, what are you, like these like pagan rituals. So she herself is erasing her own culture, and I try to remind myself that the way that she raised me is like being like very religious and Christian is not the only way I can identify myself, because there's also this other history that they don't talk about. They don't want to even like touch it. So the only way I can address that is through making art and going and trying to look for it in myself.
So when I was 11, I was actually But coming back from soccer practice, I was really late, and I knew my mom was really mad at me, and she was gonna hit me at home with the sand. And I was very scared. Yeah, la chancla. I say zapatilla. Yeah, everywhere. But I lived only 3 blocks away from the train, and on the second block from the train, I actually got tackled and I got handcuffed by a police officer just because I was sprinting in my neighborhood. I was just scared that my mom was gonna beat me up. That's essentially why I was sprinting. Had it not been for a group of like drunkards that usually drink on the corner, who like actually advocated for me being from the neighborhood, who wasn't doing anything, I would have probably been taken to the station and my life would have been ruined forever. Stuff like that. I went to a white school in upstate New York where I was one of the first people that they have ever seen that were brown, had tattoos, and looked like they would beat them up, you know? So it's crazy. And stuff like that always stays with you, and that infuriates me to produce more work to represent, like, you know, people who look like me. But I think that every single one of us here are doing work that represents our cultures and communities, and I think that's powerful and revolutionary because we're not represented at all. And the galleries, some of the biggest galleries in the world, are only 5 blocks that way, and we're very close to them. And I think just the fact that we're here, we have our work, and we're all speaking our different languages and talking about our cultures, that's how we fight back, how we cause change, and find more representation for ourselves.
That was beautifully said. Thank you, Max. And like, does the mixture of it make you think about your work differently or other works differently?
Just aesthetically, I think in general we love color. You think so? I don't know. A little flavor. So I appreciate the color, and I embrace it, and I love that I see so much of it around.
Part of my work is I question those who question my Latinidad, and I feel like I can't get into my community, and I'm trying to. And was beautiful just to be a part of. Like, yeah, I got Filipino cousins. Now I have other Latino cousins. It just made more connections. It's just really nice because I'm in search of a Latinx and Filipinx, like Filipinx community, and that means so much. And to have my work be a part of it is so exciting. And yeah, so I'm a little sappy about that. Thank you.
Thank you.
I wanted to give props to Jeanne and just like the install of it. I had so many people like come to me for the opening and tell me how different this space felt from other galleries that they've been in New York City. And one thing I wanted just to remark on was I really like the way that all of our pieces are interspersed with each other. It feels, I mean, I know you mentioned you wanted it to feel like a home, but it feels very much like you have this space and you picked up pieces along the way and you would put them in the center of each wall, but then have to make room for everything as you collected more and more of them. So I really like that kind of storytelling aspect of the space.
I guess it's also reflecting on the fact that we're all sharing a similarity. So you can see Carl's work and find similarities, and like we didn't know this, but we both used game aspects from our cultures. Like I used Watu, and it's a Korean playing card. They also play it in Japan, and I also used it's, how do you call the jacks? Yeah, like jacks like that. So it's like we didn't know that a lot of us were working in very similar ways, and even though our background it may be different, we were still using the same, coming from the same perspective.
I love hearing people talk about the similarities that are kind of coming up, but one thing that I also really love is just noticing how different everybody's work is too, and how that illustrates just like what somebody else was saying about, you were saying about Jeanette's work, that one artwork from the Dominican Republic isn't every, all, and I love how like in this show you really have people who are working in so many different mediums with such different aesthetics kind of coming together, exploring those connections. So that's been really interesting kind of for me to see, to experience the work next to other people who share parts of my experience but are expressing it and exploring it with such different mediums and in such different ways.
So that concludes our artist panel. We have some room for 3-ish questions from the audience, maybe a bit more. But if anybody has to leave, it's okay. You can feel free to get up and go. But thank you so much for coming again. And is there anybody that would like to start off with a question?
You guys hear me?
Yeah.
Go. So it's kind of like
Please.
Oh, sorry.
No. Can you go there? Can you go? Stand in front. Please, don't be shy.
Maybe I'll sit down. So, first of all, thank you guys for doing this and like being here and sharing your stories. Mine is sort of like a comment question. I kind of wanted to go back to a little bit of what you were talking about with that American influence in our communities. For me, I'm Dominicano, and so something that I find difficult to explain to people is the American presence in DR, that it's not just like, and I think this relates a lot to like Filipinos and most Latinx people, is that not only do we have the Spanish background, but we also have like the American influence, and how that messes with even how I even think about being Dominican, because like the reason why like you said racism works in the way that it does in DR is because of Americans putting Trujillo, this dictator, in place. And so it's hard to explain to people that it's like, no, Dominicans are not just like self-hating, it's just like this was also like an American thing. And there's a lot of complexities like that. And so my question is, I'm curious as to how you guys, maybe personally or in your work, I mean it comes in your work because it's you, deal with that it's not just like sort of like that Spanish influence, but that American influence, and then being here, and like being a child of immigrants or being an immigrant in this place that like wants your country but also like hates you.
So I've actually been doing a lot of research about how Filipinos were treated in America, especially during the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904, which was this giant fair in Louisiana that had human zoos, and they took people from Africa, Asia, and the Philippines had like one of the biggest setups there, and they took a native tribe from the mountains called the Igorots, and they would feed them dogs every day because it was part of one of their like celebrations to eat dog, but they didn't eat it every day, and it became a spectacle. And reading about that history and how my people were represented, that was really offensive. But also growing up here in America, learning to glorify American history, that whole thing just kind of crumbled. And in a lot of my pieces that I'm working on now, I try to take imagery or like advertisements from that time, and I kind of insert myself in them and reclaim what those images mean and try to celebrate what being Filipino American is. And I also want to humanize it because at that time there was also a lot of political cartoons where they depicted Filipinos looking like apes or monkeys, and how we were too dumb to assimilate with the rest of America. And I want to show that like we are not animals, we are human. And I think that's really relatable to everyone else also, like any person of color in America.
Get it. So I was born here, but then I lived my first 8 years in Ecuador, and despite that I spoke Spanish first over there and was raised the first 8 years of my life, throughout those 8 years I was a gringo, I wasn't welcome, and after 8 I came back here. Luckily I was speaking English back then, I was being taught English, but I spoke English with an accent when I came here. Now I don't have an accent because of years of just drilling. But US representation. Yeah. I was gonna say something good. You got it. Something else. And sorry about that. Brain fart. But there's this phrase that I think maybe some of us can understand and feel. It's ni de aquí ni de allá. You know, you're neither from here, neither from over there. And with my experience growing up, I wasn't really accepted here or there. And then I also right now work for the Museo del Barrio, which is a top museum that focuses on Latinx art. But for the majority of it, it's mainly Puerto Rican, Dominican, and Mexican and Central American art, which is fantastic. But they don't have Ecuadorians, they don't have Peruvians, Colombians, South Americans, very rarely. So at least with my work, I try to, be overtly North American from Queens, but also from Ecuador, because I gotta carve out that space for myself, because there's nothing there yet. So at least with my artwork, I'm trying to open up that new path for those who have like my specific cultural ties.
I don't really have anything like tied to my work here, but I just have like a little anecdote. When I was young, my dad, he picked up from a garage sale this like bronze lamp, and it was a sculpture of Magellan, of Ferdinand Magellan, who was the Portuguese explorer that discovered the Philippines. And I remember like that lamp, and I was very young. I must have been like 6, but that lamp always gave me nightmares when I was young. And it would just be like, it was big and like maybe like 3 feet tall, and it would always be like on my bedside. And then one day my dad noticed that I started just putting a towel over it. Like I just couldn't stand looking at it before going to bed. So yeah, I guess just in like a lot of our works, we're just like trying to push back and decolonize this imagery and the space. Yeah, I need to find that lamp though. I don't know. I told them. Yeah, I told them to get rid. I told them to get rid of it, and now I'm like, oh, I should have held on. You probably.
He's like in that garage or like the basement somewhere.
Yeah, I'm gonna look for it. It's probably under that same topic. Honestly, yeah. Keep going.
I just have like a story that's unrelated to art, but that you just made me think of. And one of like those, there was like an advertisement on TV when I was living in Colombia for school shoes. And the advertisement was literally like one kid asking the other, "Where are your shoes from?" And the kid's like, "Oh, they're from Miami." And then the kid's like, "Oh, just kidding, they're jazz." So this is oh, and we're watching, this is like everybody in Colombia that you talk to, they'll sing you the song for this like commercial. And it's something that's kind of like embedded in your head. So like what you were saying just really makes me think that it's not just like once you get here that you're kind of taught that you're in a place of like inferiority, but that you're like arriving, or your family's arriving already with like those seeds planted, and you've been like soaking in it for a really long time. And so just that really resonates.
Do we have any other questions from the audience?
Hello. This is sort of like a vague question with a lot of reference points. I want to know how a sense of maybe ethics and or responsibility comes into play with your art making. I think there's the facet of art making that is therapeutic and you're processing something, but there's also the question of representation. How do, as you're processing something, do you feel the authority to responsibly say your message? I think I got it. That's a pretty good question. All right.
Anybody want to start this one out?
So when I first started art school, I was really interested in like illustration and comics, and I was really into manga and anime, and like all the teachers were like, "You can't do this. Like, like that's silly, and you need to be serious, and like considering your background, you need to like get serious and like do something like more substantial. So that's when I realized that especially there was one teacher who made me like she forced me to really dive deeply into my background, and I almost like ignored what it initially brought me to art school, because I just wanted to make little stories and like illustrate them and like make comics. But then I felt that I had this other part of me that like obviously was not represented at all. Like I only know one person who is half Korean, half Mexican, and it's my cousin. Like, and he does music, and so we briefly talked about it one day, how like we have to be very careful about how we approach our work, because we don't want to make people think that like someone like us would what am I trying to say, like yeah, like something that
You're the voice of the
yeah, and you can't have like something too inappropriate or offensive, like, and like I sometimes like get jealous of like artists who like go all out, like doing like nude works and all these things, and it's like I cannot do that. So yeah.
Sorry, I want to interject also. I want to like how this feeds into like being pigeonholed as well as like, a person of color, and how those two possibly
just a few different points. I would say, as a photographer, I think about ethics a lot. I was introduced to a school of photography that's like street photography. I was obsessed with like Jamel Shabazz and you know these photographers that like Bruce Davidson, just like scavenging New York City for like this shot. And so when I got into photography, I was documenting Queens and I was documenting my family, and then I got into art school, and that's what my work was, like straight silver gelatin, just very candid images, very honest images, and no one knew how to critique my work. They didn't know how to talk about it. I went to the School of Visual Arts. That was a very traumatizing experience, I'm not gonna lie, but it's also what made me an educator. So I'm very happy for that experience, actually. I didn't have the language to talk about their art, and they didn't have the language to talk about mine. And I, for a long time, would just cry in the darkroom because I thought that this wasn't art. Like, this is, I guess my grandmother hanging out in the kitchen isn't art. Or, you know, if I wasn't taking that nude photograph of myself in the bathtub. Or like smoking a cigarette with like Rembrandt lighting. I don't know. I have no idea. I don't know. And then I abandoned it, which was the sad part, is that I really truly abandoned it, and I was like, okay, I'm gonna do this like super conceptual, at the time, what is his name, Dutch photographer, I'm blanking right now, sorry. He's not even Dutch, Wolfgang Tillman. Anyone here know Wolfgang Tillman? So PJ's like me. Wolfgang Tillman was all the rage, and so everyone's photograph was like that, like someone's like cock out, I don't know, it was like really random, the way that he installs his work as well. That was really popular, and I was like, okay, well, I guess this is the work that people know how to talk about, so this is the work that I'm gonna have to do, but it was so disingenuous and it was not honest at all, and it was really bad. And then I went back to photographing my mother, actually, and my mother was battling cancer, and just straight, I'm gonna document this disintegration of your physical body. And then it became a trust thing. And then I realized in that moment that I had the responsibility to my subject to project them in a way that they felt honored. And so now I've been thinking a lot about what is it to create work out of place of love. And I think a lot about bell hooks. Anyone here? Bell hooks, yes. And if I am operating from a place of love, then that means that I have a real serious responsibility, right? And what does that look like? And also understanding that I'm not going to get it right every time. And that I have a community of individuals that are willing to hold me accountable, and that I then have to hold myself accountable. I also, I straddle the United States and also the Dominican Republic, and I go there and I'm armed with this camera, and it's a barrier. The moment you pick up this object and you put it in front of your face, you are automatically creating a wall between yourself and the experience. And so I just turned 35 yesterday. So I've spent decades now as an observer, as being in this moment, but at the same time being simultaneously out of it, already thinking about the past. Because what I'm capturing is the past. And what does that mean when I'm in this space with strangers or friends of family, and I'm climbing up on top of this table to capture the rosary that's being done? And that's very private and very personal for these women who come together every day at 3 o'clock to do this rosary. And that I'm here clicking away. And what does that mean? And my aunt last year was like, what do you do with these pictures? Like, what do you do with this? I'm like, oh, I make books. I'm a book artist, and I show my work in exhibitions. And they're like, people want to see this? And I'm like, I don't really know if other people want to see it, but I want to see it on the wall. Like, I think that my grandmother being bathed by my aunt is just as worthy as wall space as this Wolfgang Tillman and Frank Ocean portrait. Like, I don't know. It's one of his most famous portraits. As modern day, you're like, oh, now I know who Wolfgang Tillman is.
I had a question. When you talk about ethics and culture, are you talking about appropriation?
I think that there are a lot of facets to this question as marginalized artists of color. That it can go in a lot of ways. Appropriation is one of them. But also, I think I'm interested in that sort of art as fun, but then also responsibility and the sort of the balance of those two. I don't know. You can go through appropriation if you want.
Yeah. Well, no, only because when I do research, I definitely reference certain patterns, but I don't necessarily just take it and put it in my work. That's not what it's about. I transform them into other things. But you're also talking about responsibility, and frankly, part of me is just throw responsibility out the door, because it's really why are you making your work? You just make it for the questions you're asking, not what they're wanting you to answer, I guess. I don't know if that makes any sense.
There's a hand. There's a hand.
Yeah.
So we're going to wrap up and conclude our audience portion of the artist talk here, but it's not the end of the night. We're going to stay for another hour until 9 o'clock. The artists are going to be here and we're going to be here. So if you have any questions, please feel free to find the artists and just continue the conversation. Thank you again so much for coming here today. This has been an amazing experience. And something that I want to say is also the artworks Most of them are available for sale, and 100% of the proceeds will go to the artists. So if anybody is interested in purchasing, please also just feel free to find the curator or any of the artists. Thank you and have a good night.